commissioner is going to come up, and I'll sit over here.
Okay, sounds good.
How's the temperature?
Sorry,
Are we good, Linda? Good afternoon, Senate Institution. It's first day of 2024. Well, not the first day of the third day, but first day of the session. We're glad to be back. We're going to spend some time with the BGS folks today. And before we get started, just because it's the first of the week, just like to go around and just introduce everybody in the room. So starting right here.
I'm sorry, but I gotta know, say you do not have permission to go live. But it's live. Okay, go on.
So go ahead.
Yeah, Dick Mazza, a senator from Grand Isle, Chittenden County.
Wendy Harrison, Senator from Wyndham District.
Irene Brenner, Senator from Chittenden North, which includes Fairfax.
Brian Collmore, Rutland.
Senator Russ Ingalls, Essex District. And we have over here.
Lynn Lehman, assistant.
Sounds good. Well, we're going to start our discussion again with, as I said, with BGS. We have the commissioner folks in here. And Commissioner, who would you like to have start?
I'll sit in the seat and I'm gonna move my stuff over, Joe, so you can sit without my coat. I can move. I'm mobile. So for the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch. I'm the commissioner of BGS. I think I was appointed 3 years ago. I think it was about 3 years ago. So thank you for having us here today. It's really nice to see you all again.
You too.
See you as well. Glad to have you here.
And we've just been a little bit busy. Just a little bit.
So,
But it's nice to see you all again. So I was asked to come in today, and before I continue to go, also today we have Joe Asia, who is the Director of Design and Construction, and Kate Eberly, who is our Communications Director and Legislative Affairs. So happy to have them here. And Joe, as always, will jump in, right, Joe?
absolutely.
Okay, where we always come as a pair. Most of the time. And Joe and I obviously work very closely together in the office. A lot of my time is spent supporting design and construction. It's also something that I love as an engineer in my professional background. So I get drawn to it as well. It seems like we keep getting drawn into your program, Joe.
Yes.
For better or for worse, right?
Yes.
That's right. So I have two presentations that I've prepared, or we've prepared for today. And we're gonna start with the flood. A lot of this you've already heard, but we'll have some updates to offer as well. So as you all know, and I'm sure will be a large discussion for the session, was the July flooding event and the impact it had throughout the state of Vermont, including the Montpelier Capitol Complex, and obviously making buildings more resilient moving forward. So as you all know, the flood event came. It basically was, I would say, a 24-hour, I would say 26-hour event where basically by 2 o'clock on Monday, we gave word that we needed to evacuate buildings because we were getting concerned about our ability to get out of the parking lots. And then we came back the next day. Joe was one of the first people on the scene, and the water didn't recede to the point that we could get to the buildings until about 4 o'clock the next day. But what's amazing about all of that, right, is it came up very quickly, and then it receded very quickly. But during that period, it did substantial damage to many of the buildings in the Montpelier Capitol Complex. Many of these buildings were built a long time ago, and unfortunately were built in the floodplain, as many cities and towns throughout the state of Vermont have been built around rivers, right? It was really good for agriculture. It was really good for transportation. So there's a lot of reasons why people built houses and other types of dwellings along rivers. Unfortunately for us, we do have flooding events from time to time, and that's what happened here in the Montpelier Capitol Complex.
Steve, do you want a chair right here? Grab one of those chairs. You don't need to stand there if you don't want.
It's good for me.
Okay, well,
I'll just leave.
Okay.
Okay, thank you though, I appreciate it.
Next slide.
Unless I'm making you nervous.
So the next slide is a map of the Montpelier Capitol Complex, as well as we're showing what's called 11 and 13 Green Mountain Drive, which is where we have the liquor warehouse and the office building next to the liquor warehouse. And so in total, we say roughly 15 buildings were impacted, and they were impacted in different ways. Either they were impacted like 2 and 4 Aiken because the electricity is fed off of 133, and so those buildings did not get flooded, but they lost power. all the way to, we had buildings that had water on the first floor on the south side of the street. And so it really varied in terms of the impacts. We also, unfortunately, have a lot of electrical, plumbing equipment in basements and sub-basements on this side of the street. We'll talk about those because those are going to end up being the most costly buildings to recover from the flood. So this is a map kind of showing the different levels of damage, and we basically group them into 3 groups, and we'll start talking about that on the next slide. So the first group is 6 properties had minimal damage, and that was 118, and I don't have my cheat sheet, but it was 118 State Street, which is which building? I get them when.
Behind the ag building, so.
Right, who's
recess.
Women's Commission or Veterans Affairs is in there. So 118 is Veterans Affairs, so these were all buildings that were impacted on the south side of the street in the basement. 120, everybody knows that building, that's the DMV building. 122 is the heat plant. I should have off the top of my head again, just in the basement. We talked about 2, 4 Aiken and 6 Baldwin, and again, it's because the power is fed from 133. And then
And which are 2 and 4 Aiken, excuse me?
2 and 4 Aiken are
Actually,
actually
right next to us, or?
one, you know where the pink lady is?
Yeah.
Across the street, it's the green building and the red building, those
Okay.
2 and 4 Aiken.
Thank you.
Those are occupied by the legislature. Right. The next group on the next slide. So 5 properties had significant basement damage. The buildings are open and operational. So that's 110 State Street. So folks remember last year we asked permission to sell the building, 110. We did get a permission through the Capitol bill to sell that building. We were getting ready to put it on the market, and then the flood came. So, so that is still within our portfolio today. We also offered that property to the city of Montpelier. So if you remember, there were 3 properties, and we gave opportunity. Montpelier never came back and said that they wanted to purchase the property. We did reach out to them a couple of times. So that's 110 State Street. 116 State Street is, that's why I didn't mention
Agriculture.
it. Oh, the agriculture building. So this is the one that kind of has those big blocks on the outside of it. It looks a little bit different from the rest of them that are there. It's sort of unique in its architecture. And again, that one had water in the basement, but in the basement was the ADA accessible restroom. And so that's a pretty big impact to that building. 126 State Street is,
Veterans.
oh, we just talked about that one. So that one's there.
Their veterans are in 2 locations.
Right. And then 128 State Street is always the building that I say is my favorite building, and that's Secretary of State. It's just an absolutely gorgeous building. If you've never had the opportunity to go inside, you may want to ask Secretary of State to take a peek. It's absolutely gorgeous. And then, as I mentioned, 13 Green Mountain Drive, which is was previously a liquor warehouse office space. They have since moved out of that space, and that building is vacant at the moment.
All those buildings so far that you've named are operational.
That is correct.
Question, Chair. So Jennifer, did you mention that Montpelier, the city thereof, expressed no interest one way or another in 110? Did anybody?
We never had the opportunity to put it on the market because
We'd asked to check with the city first before we put it on the
that's
market,
right.
correct?
And so
what-
that's
how
right. And
we
then there was a
did
time
that.
frame in which we had to wait. And then right when we got to that time frame, that's when the flood came.
So is there any way, and I don't know, I mean, I know this well enough, way more than I do, to sell it as is, thereby sort of eliminating any need for repairing it?
So the governor, being as honorable as he is, would like us to actually repair that building before we put it on the market. So whoever buys it.
And I would say that would be the wise thing to do to bring the money forward. Actually, it's probably even a better situation than what it was before, because it did have some significant flaws as far as in a building that could be used in an office setting. One of the reasons why we're looking about unloading it. And I think with my own opinion and the business that I'm in, I bet it would be a more valuable building with the works that you guys are gonna end up doing with it, I would guess.
I think so too. And then the next slide. So these are the 4 properties that we talked about that had water on the first floor. And as such, 132 is considered the auditor's building, 134 was considered the information center, 136 Arts Council, and 144 is Green Mountain Care Board. All of those buildings had water on the first floor. 144, I think we've talked about this before, probably had about 5 feet or so
Yes.
in that building. So it looked like a big bathtub. We couldn't even open the door when we went to go open the door because there was so much water pressure pushing.
Also, it drops down a little bit right there
It's
too.
the one that's lowest in elevation of all of our buildings on the first floor. And so one of the challenges to these buildings was that what we were told by FEMA is that if you do anything that looks like a permanent repair, but you haven't gone through the planning process and you haven't gotten approval, you could risk getting federal reimbursement for those improvements. And so as such, we've left those buildings vacant for this time period. And we said we'll go through planning, we'll all coalesce around what the final solution looks like, and then we'll make the permanent repairs.
But they're also not wet, they're dry now, right?
Right, so we went through, and we sort of did those different phases of recovery. And so we have gone through and we did the first phase, which is mucking out, which is a real term, I didn't know that before, somebody made that up. But taking all that sludge
From
and putting
barns.
it into, is that where it started? And putting all that sludge into trash bags and bringing it out of the basement. And then you dry it, so we're ventilating it and we're heating it, and dehumidifying the space. And then we went through and we cleaned it and disinfected it. So that was really in that first phase. That has been done throughout all of the buildings. And as you can imagine, that was a Herculean effort with all the buildings that were damaged. And so we did bring in ServPro. There's a local company here in Vermont, but given the flood and they were pulled in a million different directions, unfortunately, they didn't have the workforce for BGS. So we brought in a different outfit actually too. And they came together with, I think, around 150 people.
Yes.
And 150 people, and we're here for 2 or 3 months. So when you think about the workforce, that's significant.
That causes.
That cost us, we have that on a slide,
Okay, first.
$24 million.
Yeah, it was 20 million when we heard the first presentation.
Can I just say, I am so impressed by your response, your agency's response, because I mean, I've seen a lot of storms, hurricanes in Florida and buildings just, and it's so important to be there immediately and put all the effort in immediately. And just the National Life building, the historic building, I mean, they're all historic, but seeing those giant tubes coming out of the building so quickly was just amazing. So just thanks to everybody, because that doesn't happen by accident. It takes a lot of coordination.
It did, and really what was great, and this is the State House in Janet Miller was fantastic. We needed a place to quickly station ourselves, right? Because we didn't have a home. We were in 134, and many of the other buildings, right, had been flooded. So where were we gonna go? And Janet let us stay for a couple of weeks, which was great. And we had a whole team pulled together, and we just sort of worked together and really collaborated and were supportive. And so a lot of building blocks naturally fell into place. ServPro is one of them. And it was one of these things, I have to say, sometimes you go with your gut feeling. I'm always a big believer in my gut. And our deputy, Dave DiBiase, had a gut feeling around ServPro. Sure enough, they were amazing. And Joe, we'll talk about HP Cummings in a minute, but Joe had a really good gut feeling about HP Cummings, and they've been fantastic. So it all fell into place and worked seamlessly. It's an amazing team at BGS. So they are sitting there, they're basically mothballed, those 4 buildings, they've been dried out, we've removed all the wet materials. They have a little bit of minimal heat in them for the winter time, but other than that, they're sitting there, and they're safe, they're locked, they're secure. We do check on them on a daily basis with security just to make sure, but they will be sitting vacant for some period of time. And then of course, next slide. And then we have our monsters. So these are our big beasts. These are the ones that are going to be really expensive and costly to repair and renovate as we recover from the flood. And that is 109 State Street, also known as the Pavilion. We have several elected officials in that building, including the Attorney General's office, the Governor's office, and the Treasurer is in that building. And then 111 State Street is the Supreme Court. So the judicial branch is in that building. Those two are connected by a connector. And then we have 133 State Street, which is also known as the tax building. And the reason why these buildings are going to be so costly is because they have massive building systems. And all of those building systems are either in the basement or the sub-basements. And in the future state, we will need to move those building systems up to 2 feet above flood elevation. So when you think about that, that is going to be extremely costly. One, just because it's costly to replace the equipment, even if we put it back where it was before. But two, now you're relocating that equipment, and where is it going to go? And if you take up space inside office space, then what happens to the office space that you lost? So it is a bit of a puzzle, and we're gonna start working on that puzzle as we move into the planning phase in earnest. So right now, in those buildings, all of the buildings that we can, other than the 4, have been reoccupied. One of the things, we had many elevators that were impacted by the flood. And elevators take a long time to repair. It's 18 to 20 weeks to get the parts, and then you have to have labor to actually do the repairs. And so that means, unfortunately, that it's taking some time to get some of the elevators up and running again. So the traction elevators, which were the elevators back in the day, those worked amazing. We were able to basically reinstate those traction elevators very easily. But the hydraulic elevators, which are the elevators we typically install today, those are the ones that take a long time to recover, unfortunately. So we're still repairing elevators in 109. We do have one up and running. We need to reinstate the elevator at 110 State Street, as well as 116 State Street. And I think that's it for elevators that we need to, that are
The
left.
freight elevator at 133 still has to be done.
And the freight elevator at 133. So elevators we're still working on those. But other than that, everything is up on temporary systems and temporary power, and all of the other buildings outside of those 4 have been reoccupied. I will also say that the tenants have been amazing, and thanks to the pandemic, you want to look at it that way, everybody learned how to work remotely. So what was a lifesaver here for us with our resources is that everybody was able to go remote versus having to spend all this time to find additional lease space in an area with all the other buildings being flooded in the downtown location. So there really isn't a lot of office space available because of the flood at this point in time. So that was a game changer and allowed us really just to focus on recovery efforts versus having to also find lease space for people, which was great. So the next slide, oh, you're right there. So
Is the governor, without impacting security, don't answer if it does, is the governor back in the pavilion building?
So the governor can reoccupy anytime. I'm not sure when he plans to reoccupy. He's been at the Dill building as his coop space, so basically your temporary alternative space. And he's been co-located there, which I actually think worked really well, because then he was co-located with the emergency response teams.
Right.
And so it allowed him to have a lot of direct contact with staff that was working on recovery statewide. So actually that worked out really, really well. But we do hope someday that he will come back. His office is ready. We did have a little bit of mold in his kitchen, so that's been replaced, which is great. But getting back to the comment about moving so quickly, that was one of the first things we heard from the insurance company, which was, you need to take action immediately, because we're not gonna pay for additional damage because you didn't do your due diligence, basically mucking out and drying out the buildings. So had mold continued to move up through these buildings, that would have been a cost on the state. And obviously we can't risk that. So there were many reasons we moved quickly, but one of them was to make sure that we didn't get mold further up into the buildings, which would have cost us a lot more money and time to remediate. So here's a picture. This is mucking out. I remember this day. It was a Saturday. It was really, really hot. It was really, really humid, and the sun was shining all day long. And I was walking around with water, making sure that everybody was drinking water because I was worried about heat stroke and things like that. But basically, we had at least one representative from each of the different tenant groups for each of the buildings, and ServPro wearing all of the protective equipment. They were really great about that. We'd go down into the basement, bring up all of the what we call contents, and then whoever was the tenant would go through the contents and kind of do that sorting that you see sometimes. What are you gonna keep? What are you gonna throw out? And obviously documents was really important. So all documents were retained, and we have sent the documents down to be recovered. We don't have them back yet, but they are still working to recover those documents. Basically, they go and they get freeze dried, and that kind of stops any additional deterioration. And then they go through a process to kind of revive them the best way that they can. So that's happening now. And we're working with state archives to do that as well. So this is that day. You can see they brought out many things. People, are starting to put things in piles and doing that sort. So that's that picture. Next slide. And then we've been working on sort of what I call this interim phase 2. Interim phase 2 is really getting buildings back on temporary power and temporary systems so they can be reoccupied. we recognize that this is the hub of state government. You have all of your elected officials here in the Montpelier Capitol Complex, the State House is here, all three branches of government are here. And so it's really important that we can get buildings up and running as quickly as we can so we can help the functioning of state government. And so our goal was to be able to reoccupy all the buildings that we could prior to the legislative session. That was really the goal that we had in mind, and we hit that goal. So that was phenomenal. We feel really good. But this gives you an example of sort of an interim period process that we went through. So as you all know, there was the pavilion with the auditorium. And I know the Democratic caucus used to use it. I'm sure the legislature used it for other reasons as well. And we have lots of other groups that use that space too. And so there is no other place to have a large meeting in the Montpelier Capitol Complex. Basement of 133, which was the other location where we had some conference space, also got flooded. And so right now it's just gutted and it's sitting there. And so this is a picture. This is actually 111 State Street. This is behind the Supreme Court where we used to have the stack area for libraries.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We went on a field trip last year.
It's always been our intent at some point down the road, right? We put in a capital bill request last year to refit this space up for the judiciary. And so we went to Guidehouse, which is who's supporting Doug Farnham, the recovery officer. And we said, hey, we need a temporary large meeting space. And we have this opportunity in the back part of 111 State Street. Is that something that's FEMA eligible for a temporary measure? And they said, absolutely. So what you're looking at here is a large meeting space that can accommodate up to 200 people. And it's been fit up with technology, just like you have here in this room. And it can be used by anybody that would like to use it, state employees, all three branches of government, whoever would like to use this space. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's really, really beautiful, pretty space.
FEMA so far, FEMA pays it all.
So FEMA reimburses us. So what's happened is we have basically two accounts, one in property management, that's the leasing side, and we have one in fee for space, that's the state-owned side. And what we're allowed to do is we're allowed to go into deficit into those two programs, but it's a way of capturing what we've spent to date. And so it's kind of like a loan program in a way. So what happens is we spend the money and then we seek reimbursement from FEMA.
Yeah.
And my understanding, and this is where Doug Farnham, hopefully you'll have him in because he's really good about talking about the financials, but my understanding is that I think we were aiming for 90% match. I'm not sure if we were successful, but I think we were, but again, good question for Doug. And then I believe, wasn't there the special
30 days for 100%.
30 days for 100%, and the governor gets to pick whatever that 30-day period is. And I don't, again, that'd be a good question for Doug. I don't know if that time period has been selected yet. And it's statewide, correct. So FEMA will reimburse us for a significant amount of the work that we're doing here in the complex, as well as obviously statewide, as Joe said. But again, I would highly encourage having Doug here at some point to talk about that. But anyway, this is just an image where we're trying to show you how we are trying to find temporary measures to provide the spaces that we lost during the flood. And this is one example of that. At some point, you guys should see it. It's absolutely gorgeous. And then the last slide. Oh, okay. So, and then the final phase, we're now moving into phase 3, which is the planning phase. And this phase will take us a little bit of time, right? Lots of buildings. And we need to do our due diligence on what does resilience look like for these buildings? What does mitigation look like? And we want to make sure that we build back better and smarter and more resilient than we were before the flood. What we're going to go and do is similar to Waterbury. We're studying the river because we need to understand the river and hydraulics and what happens during a flood, because the river is a big key piece to this. And then we're going to look at probably 4 different alternatives or so, maybe one less, one more. And then we will provide those alternatives to the administration and the legislature. In the case of the Waterbury State Office Complex, they did a hybrid between two, is ultimately what they chose to do. This will be different than Waterbury. What I will say about Waterbury, though, is we're using the same architect and the same river hydrologist. So that's great. We got it to the same team. And when you look at Waterbury, we've actually had 2 flooding events. We just had one recently when it got warm and the snow melted. And Waterbury, although the parking lots got wet, there was no damage to any of the buildings. And that's exactly the way that it was designed to do. So it's done really well. We want to do the same thing here. I think one of the challenges we'll have here and what is different than Waterbury is that they had a lot more floodplain. So they were able to demolish some buildings in that sort of floodplain that was closest to the river. In our case, we've got a lot of buildings that are close to that river. So it's harder to use the same methodology this time. But those are, we'll be looking at all sorts of different types of alternatives, like I said.
That's a question on that. So, do you use, permeable pavers and that kind of thing to minimize the impervious?
So it's in my transportation bike.
Yeah.
I actually have worked with permeable concrete and we didn't do permeable asphalt, but there was another group on Lake Champlain that did. You can use those materials. The parking lot in Randolph failed. It's hard in a winter climate because there's so much freeze thaw.
Okay.
And also because you get a lot of small particulates that go into those little void spaces that are supposed to allow it to drain. And so unless you maintain it, and Europe does use permeable pavements, but they also have big fancy equipment that goes over that pavement several times a year, basically suck and vacuum out
Right.
all of those pores to make sure that, water can continue to permeate through it. So
Right.
it's a technology they are looking at, but I don't know that we've advanced it enough yet.
Okay, so VGS doesn't have any sort of policy on using that kind of thing. So what about reducing the total amount of pavement? Because especially over right by the river, we have a lot of parking lots that don't seem to be fully used.
So that
We'll probably look at that.
That is one of the things we'll be looking at, is potentially stepping back the bank and giving it more opportunity or more space to grow, if you will, during a flood event without going over the bank. I think what's really important, and I know that we'll be talking about this, not me personally, but on a larger scale, is really, if we want to have an impact on the river and flooding, you have to look at the entire river corridor and really study it that way. So our piece will be important and significant, and we will play our role in that piece, but we are a small player in a very big river.
Right.
So
And so then upstream, you probably have properties too, or the state does.
we don't own any properties upstream that I'm aware of,
Not until we get to Barry.
not until we get to Barry.
Okay. Well, that
So all of
would make a
Berlin-
difference.
We'll figure, all of Berlin there along the river corridor. We don't own any buildings.
When you say we, that's BGS?
BGS.
Because I think V-Trans does.
V-Trans has
does.
Central Garage, for example, that did get flooded, and is also in a floodplain. And I actually worked there one time and it got flooded. I was in the lab when that happened. But that lab has been flooded several times over the years.
Okay.
But yes. And then it's also looking at, are there constrictions in the river?
Sure.
So I know the A&R is kind of working high level to start doing that larger analysis.
That's great to hear. Okay.
And we'll make sure that we coordinate accordingly with the A&R, so our piece kind of, whatever we do is a positive net gain, right, to whatever it is they're planning for the longer river corridor.
Because I know that individual towns are looking at it, but it really needs to be holistic. I mean, you have to look at miles of river, really.
You really do,
Yeah.
and try to get out as many constrictions as you can,
Yeah.
those kinds of things. We did have a little damage on one of our banks when we talk about constrictions. There's the trestle bridge, the train bridge,
Yes.
and it has some abutments, and if you look at the water flow as it comes around, it kind of hits one of the abutments that's angled, and then it shoots it back to our bank. So we did get a washout on one of our banks. That's another thing that we'll need to repair. We've done a temporary measure just to stabilize it for the spring, but we'll do a permanent measure, obviously, when we do the permanent project in the future.
Has BGS had any more flooding in any of their other buildings? Anything significant that would cause a claim?
No, we have not, but there are other state buildings too. This is why it's good to have Doug come in and talk about this. There are other buildings that are owned by V-Trans, Historic Preservation, that were impacted, and then there's military. I don't know if they had any impacts, and A&R, and I don't know if they had any impacts. But there are a bunch of different groups that own buildings.
You are pretty satisfied with the pace of how everything's going? Nobody's really holding you up other than just practical stuff. I mean, you're not gonna just move forward, to move forward when even FEMA insurance companies are telling you not to. So you're just you're where you need to be.
We're where we need to be. FEMA has been fantastic to work with. They have a lot of crisis though across the United States. So they do try to kind of get in and get out, for lack of a better term. But we're gonna close out that phase one, that sort of initial response in this interim phase. We're gonna close that out probably in the next 6 to 12 months or so. And then they know that it's gonna be a longer term period to do the planning and get consensus around whatever that final plan is. And so, we'll still be working with them, but they'll have a much smaller presence. And then they'll have a larger presence when we get to that point around, permanent repairs to buildings.
Has anyone brought up dredging the river?
So I'm not aware of, I hear it every once in a while. I haven't been part of any state conversations around dredging the river, but that would be a great question for the Agency of Natural Resources.
I heard someone said something about it. It doesn't work. It doesn't because you may hit solid rock bottom. Oh. And if you widen the walls on the side, it causes erosion. And somebody was in here talking about that. Oh, it's not feasible to do it because there may be 10 feet of rock bottom on the bottom of the river. It's very, very costly and not effective.
But like I said, you may want to have A&R come in and talk about, their efforts as well. They'll be able to speak to that.
I have a great photo of that building with all these tubes. It looks like a patient, and that's what I was looking for. But I'll find it and I'll send it to you because, it was just incredible. Just those big metal tubes coming out of the building.
And it caught attention of a lot of people.
Yeah, you probably will
So
talk photos.
we got a lot of calls about what are those tubes and what are they doing and why are they there? And
No, it was
been there for
good.
so long.
Yeah, it worked.
But I always love to tell the story. Joe and I would go on our buggy rides every night around, 5:30, 6:37 sometimes. And we'd walk all the buildings and, Joe always had his pocket knife. And if there was a ventilation tube and he's like, I'm not feeling enough air, he'd poke another hole through it and make sure the air was coming down, or he'd make sure, he'd make sure all the fans were running. Joe really did his due diligence, but we wanted to make sure that we were drying the buildings out as quickly as we could.
And you really know the buildings now too. And
yes.
you know where the slopes are, even if it's just a little slope. Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah, Joe has memorized buildings, and I got to know a lot about the buildings too, because obviously I've walked through them all, but not to the point where
Not
I'm
like
walking
that,
every
no,
floor and making sure that we're ventilating well and things like that. So that's my quick presentation on flood recovery, but yes, I would say the administration has been, everybody's been fantastic. You came out early on, so did Chair Emmons, which was fantastic and showed support. The administration has given us whatever support we've asked for and have been really supportive. All of the regulatory bodies are working really well together. So A&R is one of ours, Historic Preservation is another. So we're all working really well together. So again, it's just kind of like all of these things have sort of nicely or easily fallen into place. And so it's not fun working on flood recovery. We were already a very busy department before the flood came. But I would say in times of a crisis, right, you either do this or you learn how to work even better together. And I think that's, from my perspective, I think that we've done a really good job doing that.
We got
So,
Great, thank you.
Any more questions about this part? Okay. What else?
the second presentation is just, this is not all of the projects in the capital bill. This is just some of the larger projects that we thought you might just want a quick update on today.
Yep.
And obviously, I'm sure we will provide greater testimony on these moving forward, but we wanted to give you the opportunity on some other large projects that we're working on. As well as, at some point, Joe or Lauren will come back and talk about major maintenance. So obviously, while we're doing these big projects, we have to continue to maintain the buildings that we have. And so we have many project managers working on many different projects at any given time. So the first project is the State House HVAC project. We know that's a project near and dear to your hearts. And Senator Buzz, I have some news for you. Do you want to know what the news is?
I can't wait.
We got your air handlers installed and they're working today for you. So you said it was never gonna happen.
Wow.
And we have a new system up and running for you. What does it do?
Yeah.
Well, Joe,
it.
you wanna
It does
talk
the same
about
thing that the old one did, it's just brand new.
No, It's gonna act the same as the old one.
Exactly, sir. No, we do have some better controls over it and also providing more fresh air so that we now meet today's standards for airflow into the room, and we can actually heat that or cool that. So now we should be a lot better when, come springtime, during those, cold nights, warm days, when people are packed in here, that this area here.
That's gonna work.
Yes, it is.
Wow.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it happened.
it happened.
It happened. I was like, oh, gotta do it, Joe, but we did.
Have they worked to, the way that, as advertised, that they've here?
Well, we
it's
just
moving
sort of
here?
finished commissioning it at the end of December, so you'll let us know how well it works.
There you go.
Feel free to let me know, send me an email,
I'm
whatever,
sure
call me.
they will let you know.
Yep.
because I wanna know.
Well, I pushed the buttons over there, Senator Monson was a little bit cool, so I pushed the buttons over there to warm up a little bit. So, yeah, that was nice.
So this project is really gonna be in 3 phases, and you were the first phase to go, and that's because it was actually the easiest one to do. And so we started here, we will, the next phase, you wanna talk about the 3 phases? I mean, I can go over it, but.
The first phase here is, everything from the Sergeant at Arms office east, so includes this room, it also includes the courtroom upstairs and the Senate Secretary. The next phase is going to be the rest of this side of the State House, side of the east side, west side of the State House, and the chambers. So all of those air handlers will go into the mechanical room that is just between 111, behind the restrooms, and the access to the lounge. And in those, this summer, we put a slight addition on there so that we can do a water-to-water heat exchanger. So we were originally looking at how to provide heat to take the humidity out of the air, because you have to super cool to bring the water out of the air, then you gotta warm it back up to the temperature that you're looking for. So we're now doing that, or we'll be doing that through a water-to-water heat exchanger, which is the propane system that we originally had looked at.
So some of the, on that side of the building, because there are some talks, ongoing talks, and it looks like some decisions are gonna get made about doing some renovations to bring compliancy into ADA and such like that. Some of that's kind of hold you guys up some, isn't it, as far as to do some of that on that side?
No, because of the way the whole thing works out is the air handlers for those areas are now here.
Yep.
For the chambers and everything else, but for the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they're probably going to arrive around September or October. So they can put those in as is and provide some better airflow to those rooms, mainly the house on the 30s and the 40s, and again on the 20s. But until we go through and renovate to relocate and provide new ductwork, we will not be able to do that. However, by the time, if we go through that whole process of design for the addition, if that coincides, it could go at the same time. And then the last phase would be the cafeteria. That whole portion over there is its own air handler unit.
Remind us again, the funds that are paying for that project, are those are funds that are coming from an ARPA source or something like that as far as?
All the funds for the air handling system is all through the capital bill.
Capital bill, okay.
For the addition, we do have 1.5 million in ARPA funds that we are using for the design process so far.
So we're not constrained as far as, to be smart with our, fixes if this in fact becomes a reality that we do some construction on that side. We're not constrained by, because we didn't get it done fast enough that we can lose funding. We have the funding available already.
Yes, not for the renovation.
Right, exactly. But as far as the air handler part of it.
Yes, all that work is fun.
But to your point, I just wanna make this point because it's important.
Yep.
We can put the air handlers on the roof. If we increase ventilation with the existing ducts, it's going to be louder because you're pushing more air through the same volume. So we will probably get so we have a choice to make. We can either leave the ventilation as it was, which isn't enough for the people in the space in many rooms, or we can increase the ventilation, but it's gonna be louder when the committees are in the committee rooms. Right?
Commissioner?
What?
No,
Oh,
we're not.
I'm wrong on that. Go ahead.
You're correct in the fact that the air handlers that are going in cannot provide the proper airflow. It's be no different than it is today because of that issue. Having to push more air through the ductwork will be very noisy. So that is one of the issues. So the thought being there in the 20s, 30s, and 40s is to redirect instead of the units that are in the wall, somewhere to here, would be coming out of the ceiling. So reworking that ductwork. Some of that ductwork comes up in between the walls of two of the committee rooms. Those walls would have to change in thickness to accommodate the wider ducts. There is an issue though with if we did a larger air handler, if we go with an addition that goes onto the rooftop, like the one that we had for the cafeteria, it could be a noise issue. We do have a noise issue with our neighbor. He has grown to accept it. And so it has not been a real big problem, but he has pointed out to us that it is noisy.
Okay, so the noise isn't inside the building in itself, it's affecting the neighbors.
That is
and
correct.
That's where the concern comes from.
But if there's a big addition, bigger air handlers for that wing or something like that would be needed, and we would have to take that into account.
Right, so when we put in the larger ducts, we shouldn't do that twice,
That is correct.
because if we do it twice, you're gonna pay twice to do it. So it does matter if they're going to make any modifications to the 20s, 30s, and 40s at some point down the road. So timing is important. I just wanna get that on the record.
Yep.
Because if we don't make decisions in a timely manner, if they decide they wanna make modifications to those rooms, then it is possible we may have to do something twice or leave something that's not necessarily in an optimal state for some period of time. So ideally, you'd wanna link those things up together. I know that we're focused on the initial, which is to your point, code compliance with things like ADA. But if at some point down the road, they wanna tackle rooms and take down walls, so timing is important. Or we just won't have an optimal project. So that's State House HVAC. The next one is near and dear to your heart. So the Newport Courthouse. So I believe in 2019, I wanna say, 2020, there was an appropriation to start considering a new Newport Courthouse. The existing one is an older building. It does not function or flow for the judicial branch. With today's standards, I like to talk about it almost like you're going to a restaurant where you have the front of the house and that's where people sit and eat. And then you have your back of the house, which is where the kitchen is. Well, with courthouses, they like to have the front facing, the courtrooms and the public areas, and then a secure perimeter. And then you have the offices for court staff and judges. We can't do that in this building because it's really small and it's vertical. And so it makes it very difficult to separate those spaces and create a secure space and a public space. Right now, the courtrooms are actually on the second and third floor of this building. So there's many different reasons why this building doesn't flow and function. In addition to that, there's also the county courthouse, and ideally they'd like to be co-located in the same building. So we were given an appropriation to start that project. We did go out and do an initial land search. The only one that came back and met the criteria was what is called the Newport Downtown Redevelopment Site, I believe is what it's formally called. And but we were not able, unfortunately, to negotiate a price that was acceptable. So unfortunately, that did not work out. Then we went back to planning to better refine what the requirements for the property were. We've gone back out and done a second land search. Again, nothing has come back that is ideal. So we're gonna have to continue to look for land until we find the right parcel of land for the building. But at this point in time, that's what's holding this project up.
Is the redevelopment site the former,
The whole,
I was
Yeah.
thinking the pit, but
Yeah.
okay.
yeah.
That is a beautiful building. I appreciate that you
It is
brought a
pretty.
photo.
It looks like a hotel.
Right,
Have we
could
ever-
it be housing after we're not?
There was somebody that reached out to us at one point around housing when they found out that we would be building a new courthouse.
Talking with Judge Zone and his staff, we were there a month or so ago, maybe a little bit less than that. Has there ever been a consideration of what it would cost to join those two courthouses together and to do all of that? Have we,
There has
anything
been.
modern in that time frame?
6 years ago, project
I
of
was
your
here.
arrival, so probably 5-6 years ago, we evaluated that, and at that time frame, it was $14 million to put a connector in. The problem is, where the expense comes in is additional elevators and stair towers, because both buildings are not at the same elevation, so the connector is really acting more as a ramp between the two buildings, with some spaces. Today's price, I do not know what that would cost.
What,
It would be up there.
and the cost of the courthouse that we're thinking about, what, if we ever get there, if we find the land and we go, would be 20, 30 million?
I don't recall what the study came out when, and that, like that cost we can get you, but I don't recall what it was.
We'll talk about that some more in the.
Yeah, today is just a high level summary. So that's the Newport courthouse, again on hold until we can find some land. And then last year, the legislature put some money into the capital bill for heating and air conditioning for correctional facilities statewide. So we have 6 correctional facilities total, Joe? I'm not counting the,
5 are what we're doing for, 6 total, 6 sites.
but Chittenden, which is the women's correctional facility, and Marble Valley, which is in Rutland, already has air conditioning. So it's the remaining facilities. We were asked to look at providing cost estimates for both full air conditioning as well as some immediate relief. We have finished that initial study. You're seeing the costs up here. We also, this was one of the projects we had to provide monthly updates on, so this information has already been provided to the legislature. And at this point, we're awaiting guidance on next steps. So.
I thought there was some action that was going to happen immediately in addition to the cost estimates.
So there's cost so we were asked to give cost estimates both for full air conditioning and providing relief in all of the facilities. There's not enough money to go around, so that's why guidance and prioritizing both with Department of Corrections, the administration, and the legislature will be critical at this stage, because we're gonna have to make a decision about where we're gonna spend our money.
I kind of concur with Senator Harrison about, I thought there was some low hanging fruit stuff that we were looking at that we could do now. I can't quite remember it.
I think the language was around looking to provide some temporary relief in certain areas.
Yeah.
And what we were looking to do is, when we were doing this study as to whether or not how would that impact doing the permanent facility? So we had this study already underway when we were charged with that. And right now that was incorporated into all of this, because a lot of that could be incorporated into the final.
So no improvements have been made?
No, we have not installed any air conditioning units. We've not have done a design on that. The RFP is inclusive to take both into account, because we could be putting in one, but it would be, I put an air conditioner in this spot here, spend under $200,000 and take it out just to put in $500,000 system. So we're trying to make that work cohesively in the design process, but the so-called temporary, something to get out the door quicker, could go faster with getting that design done. But the RFP is almost ready to go.
The RFP's been drafted. Again, we're looking for guidance on where you all want to spend your money. First, both through DOC, the administration, and the legislature.
So when will you have information that can be acted upon?
I think once we get the capital bill, that will, we've had no insight into the capital bill, so I don't know what it's going to look like. But once we receive the capital bill, there will be initial guidance. I'm anticipating. I could be wrong on that. That's anticipation on my part. I know that DOC met with the administration during capital bill development. I don't know.
Okay, can I ask them that just another? So what I'm trying to get at is when would we be able to see, like before next summer, would something be able to be installed? All right.
I'm not 100% sure that, because without the RFP going on the street, it's probably a 6-month design process. Potentially for the quick version for some of these, depends on where you are and what we need for electrical loads and where we're placing that equipment.
Right. Now I know it's complicated, but so you have the RFP is
Right.
almost ready
There's
now.
been basically no downtime, if that makes you feel any better in the schedule. Because what happened is we had to do the initial study,
Okay.
and that was just completed a couple of months ago. And then it does take about 4 to 6 weeks to develop an RFP to hit the street.
Right.
So my point is, we haven't lost any speed yet. We're going as fast as we can, but we still, to finalize the RFP, that's where we need the guidance, because they may say, I'm just gonna make something up, they may say, we wanna prioritize doing full AC in this correctional facility, and we wanna do temporary here based on how we wanna prioritize it and how much money we think, we'll be able to get from the capital bill over time. So that's what I mean about we need to structure it in a way that matches the priorities of DOC and the administration of the legislature. But we haven't lost any time because we're still working.
Yeah, let me ask
Thank you.
let me ask it a different way. You're on schedule.
We're on schedule. That is
So
correct.
what we had talked about before.
That's correct. But I'm still, at this point, right, what he's saying is we're just wrapping up the RFP for design. The capital bill will be released. And then if we need to make any tweaks based on what we see in the capital bill or what we hear initially here, we'll be able to do that within that design RFP and then we can get it right on the street.
After the capital bill is finalized or before it's finalized?
I think once we all feel comfortable with direction.
Okay.
Usually I would say, it's never perfect. We do have some remaining money, so it won't slow us down on the design side, so we can keep the design moving.
All right, so that's.
It's really gonna come down to construction at the end,
Yeah, and
and having money for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we're moving, we're on schedule.
So I noticed this, Northwest is quite a bit more expensive than, you got $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, that one's like 16. I'm assuming, and maybe Joe knows, that it's the ductwork and the roof restructuring that have added the most of that cost.
That is correct. It's because of the way that facility was designed, it's very difficult to get there, and that's what that large cost is about.
Okay. Makes sense.
So when these buildings were designed and constructed, they just didn't have any airflow.
They had airflow. There is supply air going in. Any cell has 100% exhaust that has a toilet inside of that cell. So if you go to, some are dry, some are wet. Well, cells have the toilets in them. That's 100% exhaust.
Yeah.
The other ones have exhaust per code, and that air does circulate. So we do have air going into every single cell and every occupable part of the buildings that to meet the standards when it was constructed. It just does not have air conditioning.
Yeah.
So some facilities do. Marble Valley has it, and some shouldn't have air conditioning. Some of the other facilities have air conditioning in different parts, some of the admin area and or the some of the other inmate spaces for, like in Newport, I think in one of the living units where they have their meeting spaces and stuff like that, they have that. So the infirmary also has air conditioning. So it's not just, some of the facilities have no air conditioning at all. It's just in certain areas.
It's just funny how times have changed so quickly, where I don't think that we would ever even fathom building a building today without some type of air conditioning and air handling to the capacity of what it is. It's funny, it's just in a short amount of time how it's changed.
Well, I think you also look at the environmental impacts over time. We're having higher heat days too. We didn't have as many hot days.
Yeah.
And Senator Mazza knows well, there was a time when we put fender skirts on vehicles and we don't do that anymore either.
So yeah, so sorry, we are definitely on schedule, but it's helpful to know in terms of tweaking the RFP and getting the designers to focus in one area so then we can start construction more quickly. So it's really sequencing and we're just waiting for that piece to come out. So that's statewide corrections HVAC. The next one is the proposed women's correctional and reentry facility. This one is also on schedule. And where we are right now is the planning and programming study is complete. DOC did provide a report around bed counts and bed types in the middle of November, as they were required to by the capital bill from last year. And we are looking for different land parcels, and we are amending the contract with HOK, which was the company we worked with to do the planning study, now to assess several land parcels. And we will be delivering a report this session that will talk about the land parcels that were considered. And why that's so critical is because it's going to impact the overall cost of the project.
Right.
And we've looked at both state-owned parcels as well as parcels that are on the market. So anyway, in terms of giving you an accurate estimate, this phase needs to be completed. The other part was in the capital bill last year, they wanted us to look at combined women's correctional reentry or two separate buildings. Those could be two separate buildings on the same site, two separate buildings on two sites. And so again, there's some decisions to be made, I believe, this session before we can advance it, but we're still on schedule. So the next piece is assessing the land parcels. And then obviously, once we're done with that, we'll provide you with a report. And then we'll collaborate with DOC, the administration and the legislature to determine how we move forward with that project.
So remind the people that might be listening or anybody else that might not know, have we determined on whereabouts in the state it's gonna be?
For workforce, DOC would say they would prefer to be somewhere in a more populated area like Chittenden County. But they haven't narrowed it down to one particular, it's more about where can we get workforce, and that's really where they've been focusing.
Well, and being where it's concentrated now, it would make sense that the people who would transition to the new facility they're already there, so.
That's right. But workforce is the most critical thing, obviously, as well as access to services is really critical for DOC as well in terms of siting. But this one is on track, so I'm happy about that. And then the next one is Montpelier State House expansion. I know, Mr. Chairman, that you have been sitting in on the JLMC meetings and are very aware of where we are. But again, this one is on schedule. Planning and programming is now complete. And the JLMC needed to provide us direction because there were several different alternatives. And which alternative would you like us to move forward with? They selected alternative 1, which is bringing the building up to ADA code compliance. A couple, I think, single-use bathrooms.
Yes, and also in addition of an elevator and stair tower on the west side of the building and creating a covered entrance on the west side.
So we are moving forward with that. The next step was for Sherilyn, who's the project manager that works for BDS, to work with Freedom French Freeman to give us a date
We're
for.
kicking around the schedule. We've been back and forth for the last couple of days. We'll have that probably the next 2 or 3 days. We'll have a schedule that we'll be able to get back to you what the next phase of design, which will be schematic design phase, what that duration will be. And that also encompasses what was known as phase 1, which is the west entrance and the ADA work. And then phase 2 is whatever is needed after that to provide the proper room for the State House.
Go ahead.
So that'll show us the rough design, whatever you send us next?
So once we have schematic design, the nice thing is right now it's all words on a page. And what you'll get next is actually a physical drawing that you can look at.
Okay, great.
For phase 1. Phase 2, let me back up. First off, for the record, Joe Aja, Director of Design and Construction for Buildings and General Services, got to get into the swing of this. We put together a report that came out at the end of August, and in that we provided 5 scenarios, and then met with the JLMC, and they came back with looking to do something, and that something really was that west entrance in ADA to make the building accessible. And so that has become sort of known as phase 1 with scenario 1. Then there's scenario 2 through 4 and what does that consist of? It was really whether it could consist of a single floor above the existing cafeteria or 2 floors. It really depends on what phase 1 is going to look at and the number of committee rooms that are needed at the proper size. That proper size being, it was decided at 20 square feet per person was going to work because the architect did a study at 30 square feet. That 30 square feet was used during COVID, that 6-foot diameter circle, and basically this room, it can't be used.
If
So-
it's 30 square feet.
So the 20 was basically what we're working with on design, still knowing that not every single room is going to comply. However, it was a good starting point. And then also bringing into effect ADA. So it's, when you're bringing accessibility into this, whether it's a wheelchair walker or what have you, you're hearing those items we're going to be looking at also. So when you're taking that square footage, access of a wheelchair walker or something like that, people get around. We're going to be presenting probably in the next month and a half, plans that show these are the rooms that meet those requirements. We'll be looking for who is going to label these rooms, whether they're Senate committee rooms, House committee rooms. We're not going to do it, nor is the architect. We want input from the legislatures. These are the rooms. And then we can go forward with, phase two, because that'll help us with phase two as to how many more rooms do we need to comply. So that's where the phase two part comes in. So you really can't pick whether you want 1 story or 2 story till you do a little bit more work in phase one, which would be that schematic design. In a schematic design, you'll see some elevations and floor plans that show what that looks like, but not an addition of 1 or 2 stories.
Little quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So it sounds as if the use or the assignment of the rooms may change.
We don't know, that won't be.
But you said,
What we will do is I will give you this room here, will hold X number of people.
Based on the 20 square.
Right, and accessibility needs. So what you'll do with that is somebody is going to say that we will use this room, or we will not use that room because it doesn't meet it.
and who is that somebody?
I will be looking to the sergeant at arms to put a committee together or what have you, somebody else besides the design team at BGS to be
Of
picking those
course,
rooms.
yeah, I wouldn't.
And part of that was also we walked through with the SHPO, with historic preservation. And it was also decided with the sergeant at arms and everything else, basically, the main state house,
The original
they
state
were,
house.
right, I forget the date. David Sheets will shoot me for that.
Mhm.
But that we're not to renovate these rooms. So like, you know, if you need an extra foot for this room to make it compliant, we're not gonna knock out a wall just to move it. It will remain as is.
Good decision.
So, but that's what, so you will see a lot more in the near future.
My assumption, because we will need additional funding over the 1.5 million that we have in ARPA funds, is that wherever the money comes from, ultimately, right, the legislature will be the ones to make that decision.
That makes sense. It's a
Yeah.
huge decision.
So we will provide you with services, so to help with that decision-making process, but you guys are in the driver's seat for that. So the last slide, I have one more larger project. So last year you put in $1 million for a juvenile facility. If we go back several years, we used to have Woodside in Essex, which is now the new mental health care facility. You haven't had an opportunity to go see it. I think it's a great example of how we build these types of facilities today. And so that means that we don't have any permanent juvenile facility for the Department of Children and Families. So last year you put $1 million into the capital bill, and we have been working with DCF for some planning and programming, and that's what you're seeing on the screen. So this is a conceptual layout. This is not final, but this gives you an idea of what they're thinking of in terms of what they'd like to see in a permanent facility.
And Commissioner, is this the project that we were trying to cite in St. Albans, or is this the one we were trying to cite in Newberry?
So,
Or undecided about where it would be?
so the temporary facility was the one we testified about a lot last year.
Yeah.
And those were gonna be modular units that we were gonna place, and we did look to place them in St. Albans.
Yeah.
That was not a fun public meeting.
Yeah.
So, we went to the community, they were good about giving us lots of time to, advocate for putting a temporary facility on the St. Albans site, but ultimately they had a lot of concerns about the existing facility. And so we decided to look for different alternatives for a temporary facility. So right now, I'm sure you've read it in the news, we are fitting or refitting what was MTCR, the Middlesex Residential Therapy, MT, Middlesex Therapeutic Residential Community. And that population moved to the new mental health care facility in Essex, leaving those modular units vacant. And so we are currently working with DCF to fit those up into 4 beds as a temporary facility while we're focused on building them a permanent facility. I did also see in the news, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state for Newberry, and we're working with DCF to determine how they would like to proceed and whether or not they would continue to like to proceed with that location. So we're waiting to hear back more from them on that.
Okay. So just so I'm clear in my brain, because we've got some things swirling around, the site hasn't been determined yet as far as where it might be? Okay.
Has not. Again, the big thing for DCF is about workforce.
Right.
And services, right? Where can they get services?
I will always go back to the always go back. It was a very powerful statement, such a small statement, but powerful statement when we asked the folks in Maine on the women's facility about what was the one thing that they could have done different, and it was to move them 2 miles closer to the bus route. And so, I mean, I'm all in favor of making sure that we don't make a mistake. As so critical as that. I mean, of all the things that you could ask, what would you have done different? What would you have done? Well, 2 miles closer to the bus route. It's so simple, but yet that was the biggest thing that they thought that they could have done better.
And something that we're doing here, because there's such a crisis for DCF, and we testified to that over the summer and fall, is that we are working through a different process to deliver this building, and that is design, build, lease. So rather than going through the capital bill, because that would take us closer to 3 to 5 years, we're trying a different method to try to do this in 2 years. And obviously, there's also a lot of demand on the capital bill. So this is another alternative to reduce demand on the capital bill and deliver it in an alternative way. These are often called public-private partnerships. And so we are going through that process now. We've reached out to developers, we have a request for proposal, and we're waiting to hear back from them.
Interesting. So then what part of the legislature does that go to?
It was a great question that Chair Evans asked as well. So, her point is well taken, and that if it's not going to the capital bill, right, we're not asking for additional funds.
Right.
And if it's a lease, you're not gonna start making lease payments until the facility is built.
But it is an obligation that the state's making. It's a long-term obligation.
Correct. And through a lease structure.
Yeah.
That
So
is
what have you
correct.
done within the budget of that? The budget of whoever would be responsible for the services being provided?
So my response back to Chair Emmons when she asked me that question was, well, we're BGS, we're the ones that provide lease space as well as state-owned space. It's all considered state facilities underneath the jurisdiction of the BGS commissioner. You, as well as House Corrections and Institutions, are my committees of jurisdiction. So that makes me assume that even though we're not going through the capital bill, that we will be asked to testify on this facility.
I think it's a great idea to look at that mode of providing services. It has, just to protect the public's funding, because it's still public funds.
Correct.
I mean, there's still criteria, and we might want to think about that as a committee on how we would evaluate and look at something like that. You know, you still have to make sure the process is fair and open. And you know, it's a little different from bidding.
Right.
I mean, it's similar, but it's just complicated in different ways.
Right.
So it's worth some conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So
But I'm glad
that's,
you're being creative.
that's what I had anticipated. But you're right, this is new. It's nothing that I've done at my time at BGS. And so it's a new experience for me. We did hire, and I did talk to Chairman as well as Chair Emmons as well. We are using some of the $1 million appropriation for White and Burke because this is new for us. And this is pretty common. UVM does this all the time. And UVM always uses White and Burke. So we found White and Burke. They're a good partner for us at BGS, and they've been kind of helping us step through this process as we move along. They've been fantastic. So, and the other thing that I will add, and this is really for DCF, but there was language in the capital bill last year that required them to pull together a stakeholder group. And so they have pulled together that stakeholder group. I believe they've met a handful of times, but again, good for Commissioner Winters to talk about from DCF. And so they've been getting some feedback on that kind of plan and program that we just showed up on the screen.
Commissioner, going back to the damage and all the money's spent and all that stuff, very hard question, and I'm not trying to elicit a response that you can't make. Do you think it's likely that we're gonna see any pressures in our capital budget this year?
I don't know, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question because AOA puts together the capital bill.
Okay.
But again, any questions related to funding, obviously, Doug Farnham can only provide so much information until bills are provided through the governor's office. But he, again, is somebody really good to have in committee and just kind of talk about funding and what does he sort of see in the future.
And the last question about monies, I guess, that I have would be the projects to date so far. Are you like what we've done with the air handlers in this part of it? Are we good? The monies that you had were good. The bills are paid, everything's good.
Joe?
So far, everything's good. We're only 6 months in. Yeah. No, we're good.
Okay.
We do work very closely with finance and management again and with Doug Farnham, the recovery officer. And so, we're working hand in hand on the financial side.
Well, there was just some grumblings with the delays that were beyond your guys' control as far as not being able to get the handlers and all that. The costs kept on creeping up, which is to be expected. And we didn't know if we were going to hear some more grumblings about that or if you guys were good on money.
There are some projects that we weren't able to start as quickly as we would have liked to. And when we do the longer presentation and give you updates on all the line item projects from last year, there are some that we unfortunately haven't advanced as far as we would like to. We have tried to focus on all the priority projects though, because we know that's important to BGS, people we serve, the administration and the legislature. So we have made sure, I will say, I meet with Joe once a week and we go through the list, or once a month and we go through the list. And that's just to make sure that as we continue to work on flood recovery, we're making sure that we're advancing all the other projects as well. But sometimes we have to prioritize the resources that we have to manage all of those projects.
I'm still short 5 project managers.
Yeah.
And program chiefs.
Oh my gosh. So you'll hear, there are some projects that we haven't advanced, but again, the high priority projects we've been trying to continue to move forward.
Yes.
I'm curious if the State House had flood water in it at all, and how are the tunnels doing?
It didn't actually,
Okay.
but we did have water that came in, which room was it, mezzanine?
And the mezzanine sort of came in under the foundation from the speaker's office and around in there into the mezzanine. And we had somebody here overnight,
We had somebody
operations and
overnight.
maintenance here to basically just shop vac it the whole time.
So we ended up not getting any flood waters.
Floodwaters were not that deep here.
And then it's a good question, because I didn't mention this on the presentation, but if you think about it, between 109, 111, and 133, and actually 6 Baldwin, to your point, there's tunnels. And it's just like a big bath. And so as the water rose, I think that the tunnel held on as long as it could, but eventually there was so much water. When you think about 133 and you go down into the basement, you only had about this much airspace. That's how high the flood water got in the basement. And so if you imagine all of that pressure on the doors to the tunnels, eventually those blew out. It couldn't sustain the force anymore. And then what it did is it sort of equalized, which means the tunnel is filled up with, especially between 111, 109, and 133, completely filled up with water. And it took us 4 days to pump them out.
4+ days.
4 to 5 days.
4 days straight, and then it was just because the river was still high, water was still, seeping in from the low spots.
So it became a sewer,
Yes, it did.
storm sewer.
I think there was no location in any of our buildings that had a massive hole in it that allowed any of the waters to come through. I do know when I got here in the morning, I went to the Supreme Court building, the water fountain in the basement, it was coming out the drain.
What, say it again?
The water was coming out of
Water
the drain,
fountain?
the water fountain.
Wow,
Like spraying out like a little geyser.
So
wow,
that's higher than the toilets in the sinks.
wow. So well-made building.
Yeah, other than coming into the.
So one of the things we're gonna do is, we're gonna make sure we have shut-off valves for anything that's connected to water.
Oh,
sewer,
yes,
So that
yes.
in the event of another flood, we can, in theory, close it off.
Right,
Mitigation for the future.
right.
So for the time being, because the basements have been ripped down to studs essentially, and we have decided to close off the basements for now, which means we've closed off the tunnels as well. Again, temporary.
And I'm sure you dried that.
Oh, yeah, yep, that was one of the areas, every place that we did, we had
Yeah,
to test
sorry,
for
I keep-
bacteria, mold.
Before
and moisture.
Servco left,
Yeah.
they had everything dried out, so we went through moisture meters to make sure it was all dried out, and they'd gone through also and done some wipes to check for bacteria, make sure that we were good there, and on the scale from 0 to 100, 0 to like 25 was, okay, it was good cleaning. 144 was the first building, that one was the one that was 5 feet underwater. It came back, most of the swabs were still.
Wow.
They said they've never seen anything that clean before.
Wow. That is-
I saw it shortly after they had pumped the water out, and I've been back through since. It was amazing on what the progress was. Absolutely. So Senator Harrison, your comments about what a wonderful job they've done, very well deserved. It was a wonderful job. I saw it at the worst, and I saw it after it was clean. It was amazing. So,
It's
yeah.
such a difference when you see it before and after.
Yeah, it's fun.
That's why we really
Actually,
wanted you to see it.
one of the
before.
reasons why I really wanted to come here is that, and I had expressed this to Chair Emmons and to the speaker and to the pro tem, that as we were going as a committee, I wanted them to see it firsthand, so they didn't, at any chance could they ever say, well, I think they're sensationalizing actually what the damage was. And I wanted it to be real to them. And I think that we accomplished that. And so, yeah, I think it was good. They did a
It's
fantastic
important.
job.
Yeah.
It was.
And the other thing that I think is a game changer in this particular situation is that our central offices are located in Montpelier. And so in the very beginning, you had how many project managers? Five,
We had a
six?
total of 8.
A total of 8 project managers
Total
working
reserve.
almost around the clock. And he has slowly reduced the number of project managers. I think we're down
Yeah,
to 1
one.
now, right?
One
He's doing
in 10.
phenomenal
There's
job.
Tay
Well, there's
still,
Tay, so
mechanical,
2.
electrical.
Yep.
But Tay's on almost everything that touches electrical, mechanical stuff.
That's true. But if you think about that, but had we been spread around the state, like it had 1 building in Newport, 1 building in Rutland, it would have been a lot harder than having them all concentrated in one area.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you remind me out of that 24 million that it took to clean up the buildings, how much of that is FEMA, how much is state money? Do you have any idea of where it all came from or where it's coming from?
So again,
Okay,
really good questions for Doug Farnham to come in
Okay, sorry about that,
and,
yeah.
and ask him.
Okay.
He can go through all of that with you. But I will tell you this, we're committed to leveraging as much federal funding and insurance funding as possible, right? Before we have what I'll call the gap funding, wherever that comes from, whether it's general fund or capital bill or.
Right. And what's it, the 24 million, that's just Servpro,
That was
right?
just initial
Those are-
Yeah, so there's,
Yeah.
maintenance costs will be even more,
Yes.
but it's well worth it. I mean, it actually,
To,
preventing it would be even better.
right, the whole
But-
cleanup process was that 24 million. We have there was a second slide after that, the next slide after that, was $3 million so far that we spent with HP
For the
Cummins.
interim phase.
You know, the electrical stuff, just temporary power, and we're getting some of the elevators up and running now. And that'll still continue to grow as we start putting more and more online and, you know, cleaning out the basements to make them safer. Because right now you go through a basement, there's light fixtures hanging, ceilings are hanging, anything that was porous and wet is gone. So basically it's just metal that's left behind.
And the initial estimate, because what happens with FEMA is you meet with them and then they basically give you a 60-day period to develop a cost estimate for everything. You know, soup to nuts, beginning to end. And you have to do it quickly and you have a lot of unknowns. So, but our initial estimate for everything is 277 million.
For like cleanup and recovery.
Everything, for all
Put it
3
back
phases.
together.
Making everything work again.
According to codes and everything else, like those 4 buildings that were flooded on the first floor, if they were substantially damaged, and that's 50% more than the value of what they're worth, if we have to raise them up, that included that. That was the worst case scenario.
So what number was that?
277 million, it includes all 3 phases of recovery. It also includes all contents.
Mm-hmm.
And contents is anything that's loose and free that got damaged by the flood. And it includes, we took in the municipal, did you hear about Ceres? It was the municipal waste disposable company that we hired that came in and went through different communities and basically, you know, you put all of your flood damage out on the street. And they came and they grabbed it.
Oh, I'm glad you did that. Okay.
So
No, I
that was also done under BGS as well, and that's part of that 277 million.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm sure you guys have gobs of reports on that at some point.
Oh, yes. Here's what I will tell you. Here's what I will tell you about FEMA. And to be fair enough, right? I mean, their job is to be accountants and bookkeepers.
Oh,
and
yeah,
make sure
no,
that,
you have to,
right,
because
you're being honest and
they can
transparent.
come back 10 years later and take money back if.
So they require a lot of documentation.
Oh, yeah.
So we're working through
You
that.
can give us the executive summary.
Yes.
Well, cool. Anything else?
Nope. Thank you.
Well, thank you for
Thank you
having
very
us
much.
on the
Thank you.
first
Thank you very much
day,
for the high level.
and I look forward
Appreciate
to
it.
spend some time together.
Yes.
Thanks.
Very well.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll
Well,
offline.
Can we
Yep.
have just one?
Yeah.